Mexico becomes independent. So Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, which marks the Spanish arrival in the New World. The coastline of Texas was explored in the early 1500s. Pineda, although he didn't stop and actually explore, that was left to others like shipwrecked the Vaca and Coronado to explore the area of Texas. Of course, Spain claimed the area and was anxious to make sure that other European powers did not also do the same thing. And so when La Salle mistakenly landed in Texas, the Spanish searched several years to find that French settlement. Of course, it had been destroyed by the Indians when the Spanish found it. But that incident sort of spurred the Spanish to start establishing missions in East Texas. The missions would claim the land for Spain, would also protect the land from invasion from other European powers like France, and hopefully also Christianize the Indians. However, the French threat eventually went away. As we'll see in United States history next year, the French and British fought what was really the First World War, called the 7 Years' War. France would lose that war, and part of what we now know as New France in North America was given to Britain. The other part was given to Spain. So after the 7 Years' War, Spain gained Louisiana. It decided to close many of the missions and presidios in East Texas, since there was no longer any threat from the French coming in to take that land. And now with the border between the English colonies and Spain at the Mississippi River, again, there really wasn't any particular defensive reason why the missions should remain. Sadly, from the Spanish perspective, the Spaniards never managed to win over many Indians to Christianity. So the missions were closed, and they started moving most of the settlers to San Antonio, although a few basically stayed in East Texas despite the Spanish directive to move to San Antonio. There are always a few Spaniards still left in East Texas, but not very many. Then, in around 1800, France asked for the Louisiana area back from Spain. In exchange, they would give Spain a very nice place in Europe, and Spain agreed to that in 1800. But really, before the French could reclaim their land, the French turned around and sold it to the United States, sold Louisiana area to the United States in 1803. That sort of created a boundary dispute with Spain because the Spanish were claiming that the border of Texas and Louisiana was actually sort of past the Sabine River, what we know it as today, and the Americans were claiming that it was at the Sabine River. So for a little over 10 years, the Americans and Spanish were happy with basically that area being what's called the neutral ground. As you see from this map, the neutral ground's in the purple there. So once the yellow area was sold to the United States, that area between the Sabine River and a tributary of the Red River in Louisiana was basically not occupied by either Spanish or American troops, and it was often was a place for outlaws and fugitives to stay. But then in 1819, Spain and the United States signed the Admirals and Aces Treaty, named after basically the two Secretary of States for one for the United States and one for Spain. The foreign ambassador from Spain to the United States was Onassis, and the U.S. Secretary of State was John Adams. And that treaty made the Sabine River the eastern boundary of Texas. And basically, so the neutral ground actually became part of the United States. It was no longer neutral, it was part of the United States territory. So during this time period, of course, the Spanish had been in Mexico and Texas from the 1500s and the 1600s and the 1700s. But outside of, for example, Mexico City and a few other places had really not developed Mexico very well. And in fact, large portions of Mexico and Texas were basically very poor. Of course, in Texas, many of the original Indians had been here when the Spanish arrived, were still here. And of course, Texas basically had the poor Indians anyway. So outside of Mexico City, and again, a few other, like Veracruz and a few other places, you also had some Indian tribes in Mexico that remained from the Spanish conquest as well. And then in 1804, the king of Spain needed some money and basically sort of took over a lot of the mission money, missionary money in Spanish Mexico, and sold some of the land. And that forced a lot of people that used to work in the missions sort of to be poor, sort of robbed them of their jobs. And so there was a lot of discontent among the poor in Mexico. And in 1810, Father Hidalgo issued basically a declaration called the Cry of Dolores, because he was in the town of Dolores, calling for an uprising against Spanish rule. Now, unfortunately for Father Hidalgo, he only lasted a few more months before the Spanish found him and killed him. There was a similar uprising in another Spanish area in Mexico, but that was also soon quelled as well. But nevertheless, Father Hidalgo goes down as being sort of famous for issuing his cry, and the day that he issued that is basically much like the 4th of July in the United States, in Mexico, that is. So basically Mexican Independence Day, starting basically in the evening of the day he issued his Cry of Dolores, and then going on to the next day. So Father Hidalgo did not last very long in this life after he issued his Cry of Dolores, but his cry went on. He had said things that many people in Mexico were already thinking, and it marked the beginning of the Mexican War of Independence. So although he and a couple of other early revolutionary leaders were soon captured by the Spanish and killed, their idea of a revolution, their idea of basically independent Mexico reverberated with many people in Mexico from then on. Meanwhile, during this time period, as the Mexican War of Independence started in central Mexico, there had been some expeditions from the United States into Texas. The first way back in the 1800, Philip Nolan led about 30 men into Texas and to near the area of Waco. Supposedly he was looking for horses and things like that. The Spanish were very suspicious of him and sent a military expedition to capture him, and eventually brought him back to Mexico City, where he died. Then in 1813, you have another force, a filibuster force, an expeditionary force, an invading force coming into Texas. Because of the suppression of the Mexican independence movement in Mexico, some of those revolutionary leaders actually fled outside of what we now know as Mexico, some to the United States. And Mr. Gutierrez, I believe, who was a blacksmith during this time period, came up with the idea of taking an invading force into Texas and basically declaring its independence, basically in order to gain support for the Mexican independence movement. So Guterres' main idea is basically to free Texas in the process of freeing Mexico. He was helped in the fact by a lieutenant from West Point, U.S. West Point Military Academy, Mr. McGee, and so they joined forces, and they led about 130 men across the Texas border into Texas. But as they went, they gathered followers. So eventually, they arrived in Nacogdoches, and by that time, just a few miles from the Louisiana border, they had gathered another 150 men or so. So by this time, they had about 300 men. And as they continued south to Goliad, they would eventually have about 500 men once they reached Goliad. A Spanish force tried to stop them, but was unsuccessful. The Guterres-McGee expedition then traveled to San Antonio, and by that time had about 1,400 men. The Spanish military officer in San Antonio surrendered, and at this point, the expedition started to argue among themselves. Many of the people from Mexico and some from Texas, the Tejanos, actually wanted to create a Texas where you'd sort of have a Mexican-style government where there'd be a leader and they'd appoint the other, like governors and mayors. Meanwhile, McGee and some of the other men wanted elections like they had in the United States for that. And so they started arguing among themselves. Meanwhile, another Spanish force approached San Antonio. The Guterres-McGee expedition came out to fight, and along the Medina River, basically most of the 1,400 men of the expedition, the Guterres-McGee expedition, were wiped out. The Spanish won a great victory there. They pursued survivors back into San Antonio and basically killed every one of those people they could find. They then proceeded and retraced the expedition's route, going all the way back through Nacogdoches, basically killing any of those invaders, any of those filibusteros that they saw, and eventually ran that expedition out of Texas. So that expedition basically secured the Spanish control of Texas as long as the Spanish ruled the area. Eventually, there was another expedition into Texas in 1819 called the Long Expedition. But even though they too had about 300 men, they too would end up as failing. So outside expeditions coming into Texas to try to free Texas and declare independence for Texas during the Spanish period were very unsuccessful. The Spanish managed to put down all those outside expeditions. Of course, first of all, there weren't many people in Texas. And so, first of all, it's very easy to understand when you were being invaded because any large force in Texas was probably not Spanish, but was from somewhere else. And so the Spanish were quite adept at putting down those expeditions and those invasions, those filibuster expeditions, and securing Texas as long as Spain had control over this area of the New World. Of course, the rebels, some of the rebels from the Guterres-McGee expedition actually fled to Galveston because it was an island. It was more easily defensible, and it's hard for the Spanish to arrive there, especially because Galveston was being used as a pirate base. Pirate R.E. and Jean Lafitte had several large pirate ships, and so the Spanish Navy at the time in the Americas was almost non-existent, which means any Spanish land force trying to get to Galveston was out of luck. So the rebels from the McGee Guterres expedition were safe on Galveston, and Lafitte and R.E. basically started raiding Spanish ships, although actually they really weren't too picky about which ships they raided. They eventually raided some American ships. Unfortunately for Lafitte, the American Navy actually had warships in the area, and so, but nevertheless, they were pirates, so they were happy to raid the Spanish ships and basically those were cargo ships and treasure ships, not military ships. So the Spanish the pirates were happy to capture those ships on the pretext of basically supporting some revolution in Mexico. So Lafitte says, "Oh yes, I'm all for the Mexican Revolution, since that gives me a reason to attack Spanish treasure ships." Meanwhile, in Spain, they were undergoing sort of a revolution by themselves, basically because one of the leaders of Spain, Napoleon, had been deposed, and when the Spanish king gets his throne back from Napoleon, the Spanish people have changed somewhat. So Spain suffered a rebellion when military leaders sought to force the Spanish king to accept a constitution which limited the king's power and would make Spain more liberal. So the Spanish king had been on the throne for hundreds of years, or a Spanish king had been on the throne for 100 years. Then comes Napoleon in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Once Napoleon is captured by the British, then the Spanish king comes back thinking his throne is going to be the same. That is, he's going to be the dictator and he's going to be able to order everyone around. But by that time, some of Napoleonic ideas about democracy and other things like that had sort of infected or taken hold of the Spanish people, and they didn't want a king that had absolute power. So the Spanish king's power was now somewhat limited. Meanwhile, back in the New World, they were still mostly conservative. They had not had the same sort of exposure to ideas about democracy and other ideas that Napoleon had brought to Spain when he invaded Spain. And so you had Spain becoming more liberal, but the colonies in America remained very conservative. Of course, during this time period, basically the poor people of Mexico had tried to rise up after Father Hidalgo's cry of Dolores. But basically the poor people had been unsuccessful fighting the Spanish army that was here. However, when Spain became more liberal in 1820, when Napoleon was driven out of Spain and the Spanish king got his power back and the Spanish people wanted more liberal democracies with limited kingship powers, the people in Central America and Mexico were still very conservative, and they did not want that type of system moving to Mexico. At that point, basically the pure-blooded Spaniards of Spanish descent in Mexico, the Creoles, joined with the poor people, joined with the mestizos, of course, people of mixture of Spanish and Indian blood. So in 1820, basically, sort of the rich people joined the poor people's revolution. And their leader, Iturbide, took command of the rebel army. The new Spanish governor who just arrived realized that basically the few troops that Spain had in the New World, especially in Mexico, simply did not have enough power and enough men to overcome a combined rich people, poor people army that Mexico had. So the new Spanish governor signed an agreement, the Plan of Iguala, and basically has three parts. One, Mexico would become independent from Spain. So Spain would no longer rule Mexico. Of course, remember that Spain had other colonies in Central and South America. However, I should point out that it's during this time period that those other colonies are also starting to rebel as well. So besides being independent from Spain, the Plan of Iguala also basically okayed, or basically said the Roman Catholic Church should be the major church of Mexico as it had been, and that basically all Mexicans would be equal, at least in the eyes of the law. Not necessarily wealth-wise, there would still be rich Mexicans and poor Mexicans, but in the eyes of the law, all of them would be treated equal, which is a little bit different than Spanish rule in Mexico, where basically the Spaniards that came over to rule the Peninsulares, they basically had sort of extra legal rights and extra legal protection than the poor people of Mexico. But under this plan, basically everybody in Mexico, rich or poor, would basically have the same legal protections. So the plan of Iguala flag basically has these three ideas, three colors, three stars for these three ideas. One, that Mexico would become independent. Two, that the Roman Catholic Church would be enshrined as the Church of Mexico. And three, that basically all Mexican people, all people living in Mexico would unite and basically have the same legal rights. Within a very short time, the official end came in the Treaty of Cordoba, which ended the Spanish rule in Mexico in 1821. So Spain had continued and has a legacy in Texas rooted in culture, traditions, language, and people. Of course, when Spain left, of course, Texas would become part of Mexico. But for basically 300 years, Spain had ruled the area of Texas. And at the end of that 300 years, there were only three real settlements in Texas. Nacogdoches, which had more recently been started, Goliad, and San Antonio. San Antonio had 2,000 non-Indian residents. So probably the total population of the Spanish population of Texas in total, counting everybody, including stragglers in East Texas and others, was probably around 4,000 at the time. So the Spanish, again, had used Texas as a borderland to protect its rich stuff, the rich silver and gold mines in Mexico and in South America. And since they had found no gold here in Texas, they had really not been interested in it, especially when the Indians not rushed to be Christianized. And once the French threat was gone, there really wasn't much concern over Texas in Spanish eyes. And as a result, there simply weren't many Spaniards in Texas when the Spaniards basically left Mexico, which Texas, of course, is part of Mexico at this time, in 1821. So the Spanish had not been very successful. They had been successful at claiming Texas, but they had really not been successful at occupying Texas, at building Texas, at making Texas successful. So the next nation, of course, that would try to see whether they could colonize Texas, to see whether they could colonize Texas well, to see whether they could build up Texas well, to see whether they could entice settlers to come into Texas, of course, would be Mexico. But of course, that will wait for another time in our course. So hopefully you're able to summarize the way in which Mexico became independent.